So I want to talk about big data and learning, which is quite an interesting topic. And I guess if you aren't scared by what Simon has said, you should be scared, right? It's a very digital world, it's very complex, and we're struggling to figure out what to do generally, right? And it's probably useful to scare you. I always think it's a good way to start a conversation. So one of the stats you may have heard is that the majority of the workforce, at least half of the workforce, by 2030, all the jobs you may have heard this already, will become redundant. Any job that's prone to industrialization, repetition, or processes will cease to exist by around 2030. This last year, internet software started to arbitrate between couples that were unhappy, right? As opposed to calling a lawyer, call the software, and it arbitrated. Over $1 billion was made that way this last year. So if you're saying, Lee, lawyers, we're safe, not going to happen. Accounting, we're starting to see it happening. Things are becoming cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. And that's the nature of the industry. Now, what I'm going to talk about is something called living services. It's actually the essence of what's happening around us. Now, has anybody bought an Apple iPhone? Anybody have an iPhone? Right? The Samsung guys, I recognize you and I'm ignoring you. So if you're an iPhone fan, you're looking for the iPhone 7, right? You're looking forward to it. And some of you have the Apple Watch. Is that right? Anybody have an Apple Watch? Right? So you have an Apple Watch. Did you actually pay for it? Or did you get it for free? Right? So I paid for it. My bad. I shouldn't have paid. I could have waited for discovery. Right? And what you'd know is if you bought the Apple Watch directly, it'll cost you about 7,000 rands. Right? How much do you think it cost to make the watch? Guess. What do you guys think? 2,000. It's more like 1,000 rands. Right? So I feel really bad afterwards. I want my money back. But it makes me feel really special. So I got the box. It's just a watch, right? It's a long box. It's white, piano white, shiny, perfect. I felt special opening it. And then the battery's dead, so I'm not using it today, right? Which doesn't mean much for its watch status in my life. But there's a thing about this Apple product that people ask you, why do you pay so much? It doesn't have a delete button or a backspace button. It sounds way too odd. Why are you guys on about it? But there's something happening that the likes of an Apple has that we need to get as employers and practitioners of HR. And that's this thing called living service. So you're probably saying, Lee, what is this living services? Let's get on with it. But I guess the question is, if there's something happening around us, what are we going to start to do differently to make this thing happen? So living services are the result of two forces that are happening right now, okay? Now, the same way Apple is changing how they sell their product, it's kind of the essence of where we find ourselves as organizations. We need to be thinking about these different things. Now, Simon spoke about a couple of things. He spoke about the year 2020. He spoke about 50 billion devices being connected to the internet. Did you guys remember that? 50 billion. He also spoke about a whole bunch of sensors that are in this phone, right? So by the year 2020, there'll be over 200 billion sensors. So I could throw my phone really fast, and before it breaks and the insurance doesn't pay for it, I can tell you how fast it went, right? It's part of the sensors on the phone. Now that's interesting. Is that useful that my phone could fly at a certain speed? Is it useful if I knew that my phone had no power? What if I could pick up that there was no light in the room? You see how useful this could become, right? Now, if you watch the Trevor Noah show, you may have seen recently, there was this advert in the United States, which will only happen in the United States. They've launched a bed that has sensors in it. If your spouse is out of town, you can get your bed to tweet you and tell you whether there's activity on your side of the bed if you're not there. True story. True story. You can go Google it. So that's what's happening. So my point is that by 2020, not only are there devices like this, but these sensors are becoming part of your life. So the fact that you got a free watch, it's actually not so free. You're paying in a whole bunch of new ways you didn't know about it. And the reality is that that Apple Watch, like the one I have, allows an organization to come into my house. It figures out when I sleep, how I sleep. It figures out how often I train. It figures out how much time I spend watching TV. It's becoming part of who we are. So this thing we talk about, living services, there are two forces that are happening. One, it's the digitization of everything that's happening right now. So Simon spoke about 50 billion devices, 212 billion sensors. The fact is that technology is becoming part of our lives. You know, if you came to this conference 5 years ago, Helen would have said up front, no cell phones. Put it off, put it away, I will kick you out. Now she's saying, here's my hashtag, here's my handle, please get the message out there, because we're in such a connected world. So that's the first point. And technology is getting into your bed, into your house, into your treadmill. And we're going to figure out how we tap into that. The second thing is something we call liquid expectations. Now, in the room, okay, just by a show of hands, who's changed their cell phone contract in the last year? Hands up high. Okay, hands down. Who's had the same cell phone contract for more than 5 years? Put your hands up high, right? And that's a large portion of the room. Now, think about your 12-year-old nephew, niece, or son. If I offer them 1 gigabyte more data, would they change their telcos? Absolutely. And guess what? If the competitor offered them another gigabyte, they'll change back. They've got no sense of loyalty, no sense of affinity to an organization, to a brand. And here we are talking about learning in an age that's digital, right? So liquid expectations is a fact that people change their mind. Your proposition of more money isn't what keeps people coming to your organization. So if you go by what you've heard over the last 2 days, that the majority of the workforce will become millennials by the year 2020, more than 60%. Are you organized to understand these people? And how do you understand that they want to dress differently? So I run an organization called Accenture Digital. And I joined Accenture in 1998. When I joined, you had to have a certain kind of degree. You had to dress in a certain way. If you didn't use your jacket, I'd be shouted at, and I could have a hearing because I was against the dress code policy. Yet the youngsters I have right now, they have blonde hair, earrings, and tattoos. They haven't got degrees, right? And they work for Accenture. So how does it work? You know, how do we start to challenge the status quo? And that's an important thing. I've had to figure out how I accommodate this design thinking thing that Simon spoke about. There's a new perspective, maybe a perspective that we don't understand. What makes a 12-year-old change telco providers? What makes him leave work at 5 o'clock to have a beer with his mates? Why does he say no to more money? And that's a true thing. People don't want more money. So we haven't got our heads around that. So living services is this combination of two things. It brings together the notion that everything is becoming digitized. And when it becomes digitized, we have access to data. And data is there. What are we doing about it? What do we know that we didn't know last year? What do I know about your healthy habits that I didn't know last year? Right? Maybe you're really healthy, that's confirmation. Or maybe you also want your money back, right? But that's the nature of what digital does. And if we combine that with an agile workforce, a workforce that's changing all the time. Now, how do I know it's changing? If I ask most youngsters, who'd you like to work with? Who do you guys think they'd want to work for? If you're a techie, who do you guys think? Google, Facebook, right? Amazon. So I've been at Accenture for 18 years, right? Most guys that work for Google, Amazon, Facebook, how long do you guys think they stay at Amazon for? So hands up, between 10 and 20 years. Okay, between 5 and 10 years. Anybody? Between 3 and 5 years. Hands up. Right, so half the crowd. Less than 3 years. Very good. The average employee at any of those companies stays for about a year. And they leave. Ridiculously high attrition. Now the question is, does Google care? Are we rethinking our HR strategy to retain these people? And does anybody care? Actually not. Google actually doesn't care if you leave because they have a massive pipeline of similar people, right? Remember I said that 47% of the workforce is becoming automated, industrialized, and becoming redundant? A large part of what a Google would do is identify those commodity skills and find a way to become less emotional about it. If we're less emotional about commodity, then the surplus can come to us. If we think about Naik having to do everything and your organization doing everything, then we'll never change. But what if all I wanted was someone to be an architect? There are hundreds of architects. So Simon talks about SAP and the likes of Java, finance. Aren't there lots of accountants out there? Aren't there lots of HR practitioners out there? Who's doing their payroll by themselves? If you've got options like VIP payroll, right? Success factors, aren't there options to that? So part of this thing of living services is understanding what's going on around us, tapping into new ways of working. And when we start to do that, we start to think about things in a whole new way. So let's move on. So it's important to recognize how living services came about. Back in the 90s, which culminated in something called the dot-com bubble, poof, it happened. It happened, it's called Y2K in this country. You kind of said that was the biggest non-event in your lives, right? But back in the 90s, it was the era of what we call Tim Berners-Lee. He invented the internet back then, and the internet controlled things. There was a desktop computer. If you remember WordPerfect 5.1, it was happening back in the 90s, right? So when we moved from away from the 90s, we moved into the mobile era in the 2000s. Now, many of you are saying, Lee, I'm still using WordPerfect 5.1. So afterwards, chat to Simon, right? He's going to hook you up. So if you talk about mobility, some of the banks, they're offering us mobile banking. And if you travel enough, you know that our banking is actually pretty good compared to most first world countries. Our taxes work better than most countries in the world. In fact, we're the reference of how taxes work. So things are changing, and there's some good in what's happening around us. But is everything mobile? Why do you have to stand in line for your passport? Right? It is getting better. You now can get it in 3 days or 5 days. I'm waiting 6 months for a passport at some point. So in a mobile era, how are things changing? And the reason why mobility became a thing was that in our hands, we started to have these mobile devices. It became a way to communicate, a way to engage. In an era of living services, think about that 12-year-old. Do they really want to leave playing their Xbox or playing PlayStation and go to a bank? Do they really? Not really. And yet, we sit in our boardrooms saying, this is our EVP. This is what attracts people. We've got no clue. We still have fax machines. We still have manual leave forms. I know you guys are, right? We still have manual time reports. We have this. Do you guys get that? So the change is happening with or without us. Are we going to be relevant in their journey? Now, while I'm busy complaining about us being irrelevant in the mobility space and how we take solutions to people and to customers, things have changed already. We're now in this era called living services, in an era where digital is intrinsically who we are. You can't walk, spend a day without your phone. Going on a hike for 5 days? Oh no. I'll do the half-a-day hike because I get my phone. There's a signal at a certain spot. There may be a snake on the tree, but I can get my signal, right? That's the world we live in. And I guess the platform for my conversation is to ask yourself and recognize that you are living in a world that's intrinsically digital. It isn't Minority Report with Tom Cruise talking. It's Naik talking in 2016. These aren't trends of the future. These are trends of right now. And the reality is that we aren't organized for it. Are you guys getting it? So the question is, if living services is this new concept of how we do things, what do you think it'll mean for our lives? What do you think it'll mean for our organizations? So like the case of the Apple Watch or the Fitbit, it's starting to impact our lives. We're starting to know more about individuals, right? We're starting to get data in new ways. And the one thing we have is tons and tons of data. Now, I gave you the example of how this mattress was tweeting. But haven't you got into a mall or a shopping center and a message popped up saying, don't forget to use your Zapper to make your electronic payments, right? Or if you've signed up for a KFC or some other restaurant, here's a free voucher. Please remember to pop by the food court and get that happening. Now, this is the point I'm making. In those two examples of Zapper or SnapScan or the restaurant, can you see how technology is intrinsically part of our lives? Do you guys get that? So the question is, if technology is intrinsically part of our life, the services that we offer customers for our organization, the services that we offer our people as employees, do we know enough about them? Are we using what's at our disposal, or are we still guessing? Do you guys get that? And I think we're still guessing. The EVP of why we joined our organization is irrelevant. We've got to think about it differently. So I guess the question is, what does it mean for our organization? And how do we take that forward, right? So this thing could affect many aspects. Our bodies, like in the case of the fitness and wearing a watch to tell you more. But I want to talk about two specific things. I actually want to talk about our work and I want to talk about our education. Because I can talk about big data and use some big fancy technology terms. That is actually useless because no one cares how we do things. All you should know is that you have many options once you know what you want to do. Do you guys get that? Our people, employees, customers alike, care about what we do, care about the proposition we offer, and not about how we do it. Do you get that? If I assign accountability to myself, and I say you can sue me in my personal capacity, that's a done deal. How I do it, or whether you do it for me behind the scenes, the customer cares less, the employee cares less. So that's quite important. So a couple of things. I've started to see more and more things like coordinating travel arrangements, going online, self-booking, self-servicing. If I can do my banking, why can't I use it in a digital way? Why must I fill in a physical form and have it approved by my boss? Why is there still physical leave forms? That's changing in the workplace. Productivity suggestions. Now, in the organization I work for, we have 400,000 employees, and we quite famously recently scrapped our performance management system. You may have heard of that. And it's been quite interesting for us in that in the last while, we've had to figure out how to focus on the strengths of people. What if you knew that my strength, my number one strength, is actually individualization? Meaning I like to spend a lot of time talking to people, understanding who I have at my disposal to know how to best use them. Previously, I was told, Lee, you have $1 million, you got 19 people, make the bell curve work. I'm saying chuck the bell curve out, because in the context of where your employees are, you're going to change that differently. So let me give you a quick example. I'm going to steal a few minutes over, right? Heads up. So, a fuse 7, right? It's Simon's fault, right? Simon? So a couple of things. So if you had 2 employees that did the exact same job, one is in the job for 3 years and one is in the job for 5 years. Let's say it's sales, for example. The person that's been in the job for 5 years is a pretty good sales guy, but he's kind of complacent. He's got the car, he's got the house on the beach, he's kind of complacent. Right now, my boss has given me a massive growth target. And the guy that's been there for 3 years is hyper-energized, hasn't bought his X5, hasn't bought the house, and he's good to go. He's motivated. In terms of strengths, they both have similar strengths. In terms of drive to add value, who has more drive? The guy with 3 years. In the context of my business right now, who should I reward more? The guy that has 3 years experience. In the old model, no, 10 years, guys, 10 years. I've been here 19 years, pay me more. I could care less. Because the context is much more dynamic. We're living in a living world. Things are changing. Our very relevance as humans is part of that conversation. So how do you deal with it, right? Now, as part of changing the models, we've done some very interesting things. For example, we are now able to predict before someone leaves the organization. You could model Lee and Naik's sick leave patterns. How often I get sick, right? Have duvet days, as some people call it. How often I complain. How often I search for things on our internet portal, right? For different things. So I could predict that, and we've done that. So if you could predict that in my work, what does it do for your EVP? What if Lee was the guy that represents the biggest part of your business, and you picked this up 6 months in advance that Lee was a flight risk? Could you deal with it? Absolutely. So data is the heart of organizations. And because we're starting to allow people onto Facebook, onto Google, what does that mean? Okay? So that's one point. The second point is that from an analytics perspective, we have an LMS, a learning management system, that is non-controlling. So has anybody heard of MOOCs, massive open online courses? As our people start to search and do their jobs, we start to auto-recommend, the same way Amazon recommends purchases to their clients. We start to recommend, Lee, I see you've been searching on our course catalog for design thinking. Here's a course. Hey, it's free of charge. If you do this, we'll give you 5 points towards your next tier level. So we started to gamify it. And that's what big data is about. Big data isn't about servers or the cloud. It's how it changes to make me feel special. Why does that 12-year-old move telco providers? Because they want to feel special. We call that micro-segmentation EVPs. Have an EVP focused on Lee. Have an EVP focused on Simon. And they can be very, very different in the same organization. I want to feel special. If you make me feel special, I'll stick around. Do you guys get that? So techniques about how you tap into what's going on, what my behaviors are. The same way when Simon searches on holidays on Google, suddenly on Facebook it says, here's a 7-day package to go. Do you guys get that? Right, very good. From an education perspective, learning, reading examples, whether it's get abstract, whether it's things like internal CBTs, recommendations on going on a course, these are all things you're going to start to do. We're going to start to tailor the learning more and more. What if you could monitor my mindset? What if you could monitor my behavior? How could you tap into that? So you're going to start to gamify not just the work, because it's intrinsically digital. If you're blocking things like Facebook and Google, that's bad. Youngsters recognize, unlike us, that they don't need to know everything. You are told you got to know everything. I tell my youngsters, the first thing I want you to do is recognize that you don't know everything. And when you do that, you open up yourself to learning and growing and teaming for success. In the work we do, not working in teams is bad for our business. I'd rather have you see you fired than let you behave independently. Okay, so what should we do about all of this? How do we adapt to this new way of learning? 3 very simple things. Do you really know your employee, or are you guessing? I'm betting you're guessing, right? Are we asking them? Part of the key things of design thinking as a philosophy rather than a process is the fact that it's human-centered, it's employee-centered. Why not build your EVP with the actual employees that you want to retain? If you're driving 20% plus attrition, why aren't you asking them, what do you want? Maybe all they want is free coffee, right? As opposed to more money. And you're giving them coffee versus proper beans, right? How simple was that a fix? So think about that. What do you need to know? Number 2, flex your technology. Don't try and build stuff and do stuff by yourself. If there's technology available like the MOOCs, like agile learning management systems, are you using it? Are you using analytics to tell you more about the employee, whether it's about their productivity levels, utilization, levels of sick leave? How are you picking that up to deal with attrition ahead of the curve? Suddenly we're in a resource-constrained market. Even though we have high unemployment, we're struggling to find the right skills. So think about that. Finally, design in order to know and in order to flex. If you aren't co-designing EVPs, learning agendas with the employees, you've missed a trick. You know, the Khan Academy, Coursera, edX, these guys are offering amazing things. Singularity, right? Udacity. There's so much content out there. Ask your employees what they want.